Great. So good morning. I'm Peter Testa. Welcome to the undergraduate thesis reviews at SCI-Arc for 2021. So the students and I are really thrilled to have a wonderful panel of reviewers this morning. And I'd like to begin by introducing our panel in alphabetical order. So Evan Douglas, Principal Evan Douglas Studio and Dean of the School of Architecture at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Sandy Hilal, Director of DAAR, Decolonizing Architecture Art Residency, and co-founder of Campus in Campus. Sandy is a visiting instructor in history theory at SCI-Arc and is joining us from Stockholm this morning. We have Natasha, also I'd like to introduce Natasha Sandmeyer, founding partner, Studio OUR, faculty at UCLA, AUD, where she leads the postgraduate entertainment studio. Robert Stewart Smith, co-founder Stewart Smith Design and co-founder of Kakujia, and faculty at Penn, University of Pennsylvania. And Marika Trotter, SCI-Arc faculty and history theory coordinator. Marika's also a central part of the B-Arc thesis as history theory coordinator. And Devin Weiser, co-principal of Testa Weiser and SCI-Arc design faculty and visual studies coordinator. And we are going to be joined in the second half of the session by Marion Wise, who's co-founder of Weiss Manfredi, Graham Chair Professor of Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, and the 2021 Special Thesis Advisor at SCI-Arc. We're also going to be joined by Tom Wiscombe, who's going to be floating between reviews today. Tom Wiscombe is principal of Tom Wiscombe Architecture and undergraduate program chair at SCI-Arc. So the SCI-Arc thesis studio, Thesis is a very central part of the Bachelor of Architecture program at SCI-Arc, and it's a 2-semester program when the fall semester is a preparatory seminar. Students continue to take other studios during that semester. And then now in the spring, there is a thesis studio in which students are given or offered a selection of project sites and programs and expected to construct a discourse and propose a building. So this morning, we're going to be reviewing 4 students. The students will present for some 6 to 8 minutes. And then each one, we'll be doing them one by one. And then we'll open the floor for a panel discussion for a total of about 40 minutes per thesis. And we'll be taking a 10-minute break in the middle of the session this morning. So our first presenter is Mauricio Torres, whose thesis is aptly titled Setting the Stage.
Can you all see that?
Yes.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Mauricio Torres Cande, and my advisor is Peter Testa. My thesis is setting the stage for the Madrid Media Tech Center. From my thesis prep research, I had a strong interest in the role of interiors and the idea of theatricality in architecture. I began by exploring the use of film sets as an architectural concept and explore the relationship between the things that we see and the things that we don't see, the backstage. This is the starting point of my thesis, the question of front of house and back of house. Here in this thesis, which is often considered the backstage, which is often considered architecturally uninteresting, ought to be treated with as much care as the stage. To bring this concept into the architecture discourse, I started looking at some precedents that deal with the concept of the unseen. This is a Centre Pompidou, a project that inverts and reveals the infrastructure of the building and is then presented to the urban space. Next is Cedric Price's Fun Palace, creating an infrastructural space where a number of different performances can happen. These projects bring the idea that architecture is a staging of the full cultural work within it and around it and in its totality, rather than just a selective presentation of certain spaces. So my thesis is located in Madrid. In the same way that Barcelona is a city of corners, Madrid is a city of squares. And squares are inherently urban spaces. They're public areas that are more spontaneous, and we start to witness different forms of the urban space to emerge. There is no one set program associated with these spaces. The nature of these areas changed throughout history. Here, we have a military parade taking place, an event of celebration. And on the other hand, this plaza has been used for much starker purposes. This image shows a ritual of public penance, with its most extreme form being death by burning. Today, these plazas still offer the same level of adaptability, like this being used as a temporary park, or in this case, being used as a concert venue. If we were to think of plazas as a form of stage, therefore the architecture surrounding it can be considered the backstage. That is where the prep happens, inside the architecture. The site of my thesis is an existing urban stage and is located at Plaza de la Villa with a plan to redesign an area surrounded by buildings built in the Habsburg monarchy period. So my thesis wanted to continue to respect the function of the plaza by providing an update and an expansion to the idea of infrastructural theatrics. Taking into account the importance of the urban space, this thesis uses the delineation of the surrounding buildings to create a structure that highlights its perimeter. And this perimeter of the new building creates a new kind of alleyway. But rather than introducing a project that completely seals the courtyard from the public, this project keeps the courtyard as an urban space where you have 100% architecture above and 100% urban space below. By doing this, the true nature of the plaza has the ability to continue to take place, a new space that can take on different forms. This building does not intend to colonize the space, but rather enhance it by providing the gift of shade. The world of the Media Tech Center does not touch the ground, with the exception of the elevator shaft and the spiral stairs that pull you up into the new experience. The architecture above is enclosed by the perimeter structure, which is made of a series of black mesh panels that offer a form of transparency that promotes a sense of movement as one walks around it by offering varying levels of that transparency, driving influence from Bruce Naumann's double steel cage piece. The Media Tech Center is an initiative by the City of Madrid to revitalize the plaza, but also an opportunity to introduce new forms of media to the public by providing both spaces of display as well as resources to use these types of media. Creating an interior that is highly curated inside an adaptive space where any number of performances can happen, both in terms of front of house and back of house. Drawing from another piece from Bruce Naumann's floating room, this interior uses the system on the ceiling to suspend the walls that claim separate pockets of spaces to allow for multiple configurations. These walls include semi-openings and apertures that allow to see through other rooms. However, by moving to other types of spaces, one discovered the reality of these spaces where the material changes. The room seen through the other side is actually another type of space, the backstage. But the goal of this thesis is not simply about presenting performative infrastructure. Unlike the Centre Pompidou, where the performative infrastructure of the building is revealed and inverted with a serene, evacuated interior, here we're not looking to turn inside out, but rather making people go back and forth from one kind of space to another kind of space. As one moves from room to room, one can experience the movement of others through the interior apertures and the movement of of the exterior through the black mesh material. This project is about the experience of movement using a sequence of rooms, each being smaller pockets of space that ought to be feel special inside the large container. This container, the world of the MediaTek Center, in itself is a backstage of not only the contents of its interiors, but also of the new Plaza de la Villa. Therefore, the Madrid MediaTek Center is setting the stage of the urban plaza. Thank you.
Hey, Mauricio, great presentation. Very cogent, easy to follow, step by step. I really appreciated that you were able to have that perspective on your own project after such an intense period of devoting yourself to it. Could you talk a little bit about, I think the last time I saw this project, you didn't have that same finish on the interior volumes. They're kind of like, reminds me a little bit of Ian Pei's media building at MIT. These kind of white blocks that are set off from each other by what look like control joints. How did you come to that decision on the finish there? And what was your thinking?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't quite understand.
Oh, could you talk about the interior finish on your interior volume? So it's like looks like it's a white finish, maybe like metal panel separated by control joints. So looks a little bit like they're made of blocks.
Oh.
Yeah. Nope.
No.
Go back to the first image with the spiral stair.
Yeah.
Yeah, there.
Yeah. So I guess actually, yeah, I did change it from the beginning, and part of the reason why I decided to include this material is I wanted to express this idea of sculptural movement, and I thought, yeah, having this sort of like linear segments would allow for one to follow the way that the lines are moving.
Okay, so the idea of the jointing is that it makes you conscious of the shape in front of you. The volume in front of you is captured almost by wireframe. Is that the idea?
Yeah.
You know, it's really interesting because I want to just propose, if you look at the way that you decided to render the spiral stair, which I think is kind of one of the really beautiful moments of the project, with the white underneath and then the black wrapper, like these two, satin ribbons kind of rising to the main floor of your media library. I might propose actually that some kind of, even maybe the inverse of that would be an alternative to the wireframe delineation that you chose for the other masses. And the reason that I would suggest that is because it seems to me like one of the things that your project does really beautifully, in addition to kind of landing very gently on the site and kind of towing down instead of really occupying the ground plane, is it gives you the idea that something almost surreal and magical is suspended above your head. And to me, the articulation, or in my opinion, the over-articulation of the joints between those ACMs or whatever the heck they are, a little bit mutes that sense of magic. Because you immediately say, I know what that is. I've seen that before. That's a recognized size of panel, And you don't necessarily capture the kind of, it's even like kind of a pure, almost Corbusian kind of sense of volume that would otherwise be apparent to the eye.
I actually, I was picking up on the same white volume, but I actually thought it was deliberately perhaps a little bit familiar, because some of the curvature in it and the panelization actually looks like Richard Meyer's Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona, which is also a museum on a plaza with a kind of promenade entry like a big circulation ramp system, but it doesn't obviously operate like the Bours, the Pompidou Center, where the circulation's kind of really articulating and expressing itself and the activities in the plaza. In MoCA, it's a little bit more self-contained, so it almost becomes like this threshold between the plaza and the gallery spaces that actually kind of quite clearly separates a little bit the activities. But it's literally a similar language in terms of the panelization and geometry. I think you've got a very different model to both of those, because you talked about the Fun Palace, and that's clear that you can see all the kind of reconfigurability of the interior. I can see where the Fun Palace is coming in. When you get to the Pompidou Center, though, you obviously have an active plaza below the building, but it seems like there's a clear separation between the building, which I think is closer to the Richard Meier example than the Pompidou Center example. Do you want to comment on that, on kind of your choice of how you laid out the plaza relative to the interior of the building?
So I think that the reason why I brought the Pompidou Center is to go back to like the presentation. Like I was really interested in the idea of infrastructural theatrics similar to the Fun Palace. But for me, this thesis is kind of like a continuation of the work of the Centre Pompidou, where rather than simply inverting everything and turning it to the outside and presenting it, like this thesis is more about selectively choosing and going from different types of spaces to others.
Hi,
Yeah, it's a good
Mauricio.
point, though. It's a good point, though, Robert. You're absolutely right. I was just looking on my other screen at the Meier building, and it's really striking, actually, to see the similarities in the form language there. But also the idea of these suspended volumes, kind of magically hanging. In his case, he's like a white whatever. And what I like about your project in comparison to that one is that it does have a little bit of the Bours sense of playfulness, where you understand that the work is being done in front of your eyes rather than that it's being somehow concealed within the architecture itself. So that I can see the way that your project might be seen as a kind of a build on that other work. Sorry, Devin, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I think these are really fascinating points. And first, I just wanted to say that was a fantastic presentation, Mauricio. I agree, totally clear. It was like just made everything kind of beautifully synthetic for your entire project, and the buildup is tremendous. And what I wanted to just maybe pick up on is this back of house, front of house discussion that you were posing as your thesis. And the thing that really strikes me that you've done so well is that you've kind of moved those pieces around. Typically, that we could think of a back of house, front of house relationship in plan, and you've taken that and put it in section. And so that the kind of just that simple move of switching the plan arrangement to the section has now created both the active space below. It's created a new audience, meaning now everyone that's in their kind of apartments and on the ground floor, they can still circulate, they can look at these activities, and it's more like a center stage. And then the second floor becomes this other more kind of like private, but yet still very, very active place for the community to go. So I just want to really commend you on the kind of diagram shift of those relationships. I think just that simple move is what the strength of the project is. And it opened up a whole new set of possibilities then for how we can understand the public space and the square and the kind of the square in the square, and the square elevated in the square. So I really love the project, and just think you've done a remarkable job taking it all the way down. It's I haven't seen it in months, and it's fantastic to see it all come together for you.
Just to quickly continue from what I was speculating on before, I just want to say I think the plaza is a fantastic proposal. Like the scale of it, the fact that it's based on shade, it's really appropriate for the kind of climate and the culture that's there in Madrid. I mean, where streets are incredibly small for many reasons, not only because of the historic building fabric, but also for, obviously vernacular reasons of shading and airflow and things like that. And we have something here that I think is a much more sensitive and human scale proposal for a plaza than, say, the Richard Meyer version, which is the absolute opposite, where it's this big expanse that might work in Paris's climate, but certainly doesn't work in Barcelona. So I think for Madrid, this is a much more really appropriate, but also really well thought through and mature proposal.
It's Rob, when you mentioned the MACBA, I think what I love about that project is the way the whole bottom of the building at about 6 inches high is completely scraped to pieces. It's got such markings, it's crazy. And that's from all the skateboarders that are there. And it's like a really particular kind of use in Barcelona. It's just skaters and it's some tourists or it's whoever's going to the museum, but that building is marking like hardcore skateboard use. And I think, for something that's considered, particularly with Meyer's, use of the white panel, like super pristine, it's like a really violent act, which I quite love. And here, I think it's interesting, you kind of pull up the skirt, but you occupy the base in a really interesting way. But I'm going back to how you presented it, and I find it kind of amazing decades and decades later that the only building we refer to when talking about the use of public space or interactive public space and the engagement with the museum and the city and the square, et cetera, is always Pompidou. And so, I'm kind of wondering, not why that is. I know why that is, because it's a really significant space in Paris. The scale of it is kind of ginormous. And so it's one of those that while other buildings may do the same, this has become like a really central hub. And so there are often, people who go to Pompidou and don't go in, but you feel like you've been because you've kind of interacted with that exterior. And I feel like this has the possibility to do that. Of course, it's a much, much smaller site. But I really do appreciate the project. I wish we could speak a bit more on the kind of role of engaging that kind of streetscape level. There aren't that many projects that off the top of my head I can think of doing. The MASP by Lino Bobardi, MACBA, Pompidou, and then I kind of run out of room. And is the Herzog, there's like a lifted Herzog building. Is that a museum? I can't remember what it is. I was Googling it. It's a museum, right? But it has the core that comes out.
Yeah,
that kind of breaks that whole.
Yeah, it is
The Caixa.
Yeah.
It is the Caixa Forum.
Yeah.
Sponsored by a bank. So of course there you got like loads of money to do all kinds of things you want to do. So you also got to find a good bank sponsor. But thinking about the ways in which we like use art to try and charge public space, and yet we cannot get away from Pompidou. And so I think part of the project also, should be to really think about how to strike a new and different kind of marker or thesis that kind of suggests that whatever was, thought through back then is now different from what we're trying to recreate in, 2021, and how, if at all, the idea of public space in the institution has changed, or how we can begin to charge public spaces somewhat differently. So it's not just flamethrowers and jugglers, but how do we begin to like really use public space to engage, activities in the city, and think about how we can, take initiatives to push projects like this forward so we can continue to kind of lift the skirts and think about that public domain. So I appreciate the project. I also want to, kind of maybe head a little bit back to the idea of the thesis and the kind of conceptual driving of the project.
No, I certainly agree with many of my colleagues. Maurizio, it's a really smart, beautifully presented, well represented project that has extraordinary merit. I also think that it's kind of ideologically loaded in a good way, in the sense that one could debate or take alternative positions, proposing that maybe its value and its ability to contribute not only to the square as an architectural proposition, but to the livelihood and to the continuation of the production of magic. Because at the core of the program that you have identified as a kind of precedent, it seems to me at its best is it's able to deliver something back into the public domain that resonates, is transformative, and on some level is able to, when I use the term magic, the apparatus and the machinery that delivers that ineffable condition disappears momentarily. So, there's a series of what I would argue kind of contentious in a productive way areas of the project, or certain decisions that you have made very strong declarations about, which, if we were to revisit them, at least it expands upon the interpretation of your thesis, and maybe the many interpretive trajectories that could spin out of this. The columns, for instance, to me are loaded, right? Really interesting. How does architecture touch the ground? And might there have been, and this is why I think your comment about kind of Bruce Nauman is really wonderfully insightful, but potentially more opportunistic insofar as boundaries and edges and architectural territories are defined by a material that is somewhat ambiguous and has a multiplicity of readings. I'm talking about the mesh. To me, the mesh is, in some respects, is one of the more interesting devices that resides in the project, because it lives in that in-between space. It is both an edge condition and a threshold, a passage. And it seems to me that the precedent of Nauman is about the accumulation of these scrims in order to regulate transparency from something that might appear to be opaque to something that might, at the other end of the spectrum, be almost immaterial. And so in light of that, not only that is a kind of literal point of reference, but as a kind of almost, how should I say it? It serves as as something that embodies a certain kind of phenomenological condition that may work well at the site and could offer a challenge to you in terms of whether, and this is a big pivot, right? Do you accept certain typological elements? And in other words, there's a kind of informality about part of the architecture arriving as a kind of ready-made, and that your authorship situates itself more as a strategist and in terms of the tactics that will play this, or can that authorship move further into the kind of genomic flesh of these components and assembly systems and say, hey, there's more to be mined out of this. So that's where we come back to the columns, right? Because it'd be interesting to ask, might the columns have a certain lightness of being. I'm fascinated by the reflected ceiling plan as a kind of, when you think of these cultures that have continually invested in the production of mythos and magic, not as a kind of a trivial activity, but something that they see as essential as a nutrient to sustaining and developing culture. It's so interesting to think that you would walk underneath this, because I think from a diagrammatic standpoint, you're doing something that's absolutely brilliant and could be mined as a strategy that would be used in a variety of squares and cities around Europe. It's the architectural manifestation of that diagram where I think there are many, again, interpretive futures. So the reflected ceiling plan to me is loaded because it's the first stage, right? In a sense that you're going to be claiming the sky and there's a kind of momentary or temporal disappearance. The whole notion of permanence and temporality is something that you didn't talk about, right? I mean, to what extent does the project have a calendrical schedule to it, not only in terms of the performances that take place underneath that ceiling or inside the enclosed space above, but could the building begin to undergo a set of transformations over time where it sheds its own identity? Its own identity undergoes a kind of evolutionary change. Pieces appear and disappear. It's put together. I'm thinking of the Ise Shrine and the way in which, if you haven't seen it, it's incredible. MoMA made some 30, 40 years ago a wonderful documentary. It was a shrine building built entirely out of timber, and it had a forest next to it. And they would mine the timber from the forest, and if I remember correctly, every 75 years, they would unmake the shrine and remake it once again. It was the ritual of putting the shrine together that was seen as a kind of didactic opportunity for successive generations to learn about the value of that kind of spiritual, again, ethos, right? I'm not suggesting there's an answer here. I just find myself spinning into the project and theorizing about a whole kind of range of ways in which it could perform as an actuator, not only within the bounding box of what you claim to be a theater, but its relation to the buildings around the perimeter. I think the elevations of this are absolutely loaded. I mean, think of all the interiors, again, in the existing fabric and the residents that live there that open up in the morning to look at your building. Does your building undergo any kind of a transformation? Does it take into account the fact that the theater is operating both in the horizontal and the vertical access through a whole series of, I would say, various interiors? Look, I love it. It warrants a wonderful conversation, which you're getting right now. But just assume that you're going to move on after SCI-Arc and you have the opportunity to go out into the world and to really take on the demand of these public spaces in a new and novel way. It seems to me that you could step back and strategize this, right? There may even be structures that live for 15 minutes, right? And others that the entire duration of the summer schedule. And what is the architectural identity, the technological inscription of that alphabet of pieces? Because I really think there's something deep into the, for the lack of a better set of terms, the science, right? The kind of performative opportunities that come out of both the material itself, the behavior, but the kind of assembly, the theatrics of assembly, right? That open up a kind of world, a spectrum of possibilities. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. What a wonderful jury. I'd love to hear, keep this going. Fantastic discussion. Thank you so much. And thank you, Mauricio, for setting this off, for setting the stage for the review. Thanks, everyone. This was really, really wonderful discussion. So congratulations, Mauricio. Wonderful work. So we're going to move to our second project, which is Tiano and Lou. So you can share the screen. A project called, their title is Graphic Inscription.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Lu.
And I'm Tiano.
Our title is Graphic Transcription. Our thesis will examine a design methodology using a graphic vocabulary to create multiple three-dimensional possibilities that can be brought to bear on a landmark skyscraper located in Melbourne. We use source material taken from the Vertical Studio all-at-once